So you might not know this, and you probably would not guess this, but I went to college. And I graduated. Now, it took me a little longer than some. It took me actually 3 terms to get through college. I don't know how long it took for you, but it took me 3 terms to get through school, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. Some of you will think that's funny later. But I actually went to a Bible college. Some of you may not even know that there is such a thing as a Bible college. I went to a Bible college to learn how to be a preacher. No jokes. No joke. Nobody going, bro, you should have paid attention better. None of that, okay? So, but it's true. I went to Bible college to learn how to be a preacher. And true story, actually in my preaching class, my professor gave me a C. That doesn't, that shocks nobody in the room. My professor gave me a C, and I was really mad because I felt I deserved way better than a C. As a matter of fact, I felt, to be honest, that I was the best preacher in the whole room. And so when I got this C, true story, there's this place where they used to post the grades, and I went and I go, I got a C, what in the hot, hey, I got a C. I was so mad, I kid you not, I stormed right down to her room where she was teaching, she's a professor, and she was teaching. I pounded on the door and I demanded that she come out of her classroom and tell me why I deserved a C. And so she does, and she was not happy about it, but I wasn't happy about it either. Right? And true story, so she's explaining this to me. She says, to be honest, you're just not that good. You're just not that good at what you're doing. You're more, she said, more hype than substance. And I'm like, what? And so she goes, and frankly, I'm not so sure. True story. She's like, I'm not so sure you're going to make it as a preacher. I'm like, well, I'm not so sure you're going to make it as a professor. And I was so upset. But truth is, I do remember something that she taught me in this class. I do remember something. She said that whenever you want to introduce a topic, she would say, don't go too deep too quick. She would say, ease into it a little bit, kind of get them engaged, get them on your team a little bit, break their defenses down a little bit, because if you go too deep, too quick, you're going to lose them. They're going to wander. They're going to drift. And so you got to ease in. And so I'm like, okay, we're going to break that rule totally today. Okay, we're just going to break that rule. I mean, she wasn't a very good professor, I'm telling you. And but she did say another thing about when you're going to quote somebody. I remember this. She said when you're going to quote somebody else's writings, she said keep 3 S's in mind. She said keep 3 S's in mind. She says you're going to keep it short. Hold on, I wrote these down so I can remember this. She said keep it short, sweet, and simple. But I'm going to break that rule too, because I'm going to read you something that is long, deep, and complex. Okay? And so we're just going to go for it. Are you guys okay if we just go for it? Taylor, you guys open to going deep right off the bat? How about you Riverview people? You guys ready? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read a section from Tim Keller's book. Tim Keller is he's retired now, but he's a preacher and an author from New York, and an incredible writer, deep thinker, theologian. And he writes a book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Walking with God through pain and suffering. And how do we do that? That's a tough one, isn't it? And that's really what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, is how do we journey with God? How do we walk with God when it's really, really hard? And so here's what Tim writes. He says, and you got to pay close attention. I need you to lean into this. Be very purposeful and careful with the way that you hear this. Now, really lean into this. Here's what he says. He says, we must be disciplined in our thinking. You must meditate on the truth and gain the perspective that comes, and here it is, that comes from remembering all God has done for you and is going to do. Do you hear that? So you gotta be purposeful to remember God and what he has done and what he's gonna do for you, okay? And then he says this, you should also do, he calls it self-communion. This is both listening to your heart, and here it is, and also reasoning and talking to your heart. It means saying, he's like talking to yourself. He says, this is how you should talk to yourself once in a while. He says, you should say to yourself, why are you so cast down, O my soul, forgetting all of his benefits of his salvation? He quotes Psalms, the book of Psalms to himself, right? Is what he does there. And so what's he saying? He's saying that when life is hard, you're going to have to remember something. You're going to have to remember who God is, because if you don't purposefully remember, the hard things of life will make it very easy for you to forget what you really believe and what you really are. So then he says this. He says, this is not forcing yourself to feel in a certain way, but rather, listen, directing your thoughts until your heart sooner or later is engaged. Much of the thinking and self-communing that we must do has to do with Christian hope. Listen, heaven and the resurrection and the future perfect world are particularly important to meditate on if you are dealing with death, your own or someone else's. But, listen, but it is crucial in all suffering. Keller is saying that pain has a way of leading you to forget. He says pain and suffering has a way of confusing you. It has a way of clouding what's really important to your soul and who you really are as a man or a woman, or what you really value. And he says so it would be very important for us to purposefully be reminding of ourselves who God is, because listen, hope comes from God. Do you hear me? Is that all y'all got? Because he says hope comes from God. It comes from remembering who God is and the great promises that he has made to us. He says hope, real hope, comes from having right theology, the right study of God, the right understanding of God. He says remember God, because listen, in the dark parts of life, that's what's going to bring you hope. That's what's going to remind you of the promises that are made to you. One of the great problems with pain and suffering is it literally causes you to forget. And pain, it not only causes you to forget, but it also, on a very deep level, it tests what you really believe, right? I mean, it tests you. It puts you through the fire. And when things get hard, you stand back at some point and go, what do I really believe in life? So it literally puts you to the test, and it helps you to figure out who you are below the surface of your life. And for this reasoning, suffering is hard, but it is not bad. Suffering is hard, but for this reasoning, because it tests who you are, it's not a bad thing. It reveals something about you. The idea of pain and suffering is really a revealer of who you really are, isn't it? It's what you're made of underneath it all. Laments are one of the most theologically rich things that a Christian can do, because we reflect on not only what has happened, but why it is happening. We start to ask this question. Remember, we talked about this last week. What's under it and what's above it? We started saying, what's driving the source of pain in my life? When we get held up on things for years and years, and sometimes for decades and decades, we look back and we go, what is keeping me here? Has anybody in the room ever been held up on something for long periods of time? Anybody know what I'm talking about? And you're going, why can't I move forward? A lament looks deeper still. And it's purposeful to figure out what's underneath of it. And when we look underneath, we start to see the sin of the world in our own sin. We see the brokenness of the world in our own brokenness. But it also not only looks under it, it looks what? Over it. And it sees that there is hope through a deepening relationship with God, your heavenly Father. A lament realizes that this isn't all there is, and that there's more to come, that God has the final story, has the final word, amen? And that's the point, right? In that pain, it is hard. Suffering is hard, but it is not a bad thing because pain, listen to me, friends, is a pathway to a fuller, richer faith. It really is. It really, truly is. So this idea of lamenting, it comes from a book in the Bible called Lamentations, if you didn't guess that already. And by the way, we're in our series called Old School. Anybody a fan of Old School in the house? Yeah, I think so. Now, Old School, if you're not familiar with it, is Metro's journey through the Old Testament part of the Bible. Literally, we have just been slowly walking through at various times over the last 10 years, just different books in the Old Testament part of the Bible. And some of you may know that the Bible is really divided into two parts, like the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is all the writings that are before the time of Christ. And of course, the New Testament is about the life of Christ and the writings after about the early church, right? So we have the Old and New Testament. And a lot of times we forget that the Old Testament is just so full of really rich things. And so we've been dialing in on the story of God. And when we begin at the beginning, the Old Testament part of the Bible, we begin to see that God has an ongoing story. And listen, friends, listen. We learn that we fit in God's story, right? This is really about figuring out how do we fit into God's story. And so we're studying the book of Lamentations, and Lamentations is an old book, by the way. It's like 2,500 years old, and some of you are already going, boring. Why would anybody read something so old? I'd rather be pulling weeds behind my shed in the baking sun all day long, right? Let me ask a question quick. How many have been here for part of the Old School series at one point or another? One of the books, okay? Anybody? Let me ask a different question. How many of you would say, really unexpectedly, you walked out going, man, how did he know what I was going through? How? Anybody? Anybody? I promise you, if you have an open heart to God's word, you will realize it is for you. It is for you. No matter what you believe even, if you are just open even today, that you will realize that God has something to say to you. So you ready for this? You open to this? So let's dive into this old school stuff a little bit. We're going to skip forward to chapter 3. Because chapter 3 contains the single most familiar verse in the book of Lamentations. And it's a verse that is familiar to a whole bunch of us, thankfully, to an old school kind of smash hit hymnal. Anybody remember what a hymn is? Anybody? Any old school people in the room? There's this old smash hit called Great Is Thy... Yeah, great is thy... If I could sing, I'd sing it to you. Great is thy faithfulness. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Man, it is such a good song. It's an old song, but it is a good song. And this song comes right out of almost the dead middle of this entire book. And I'm just going to read to you Jeremiah's writings that we lift this song from, okay? It says this, chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, it says, because of the Lord's great, what is it? Great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. They are new every morning. His mercies, his compassion is new every morning. And then he says, great is thy faithfulness. Remember that? Man. And it's a song that most people sing when they're looking back in their life and they're remembering just how good God is, right? Because you think about it, like when you stand and you sing this song, great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Your mercies every morning are made new. And the whole song is looking back and realizing just how good God has been to you. As a matter of fact, there is this one little line in the song. It's such a good line. It says, all I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness. Anybody remember that? And so the song, it's lifted from this verse, but I got to tell you, it's lifted from the completely wrong perspective. The song needs to be understood differently because we often sing it looking backwards and going, oh, God did a great thing there, God did a great thing there, and God did a great thing there, and ooh, that was so awesome right then. But Jeremiah, when he's writing these words, is looking at the smoldering Jerusalem. He's looking at his people that have been utterly ravaged. He's been looking at death and destruction, and there is nothing, not one singular good thing about this. And so when he's looking back, he's not necessarily praising God for the different things of life. You know what I think he's doing? I think he's recalibrating his own soul. I think he's rechecking his own soul, and this might be the most important thing that emerges out of the entire book of Lamentations. You may want to take a picture of this, you may want to write this down, but I need you to focus in on this because this is, I think, the singular biggest lesson that all of us can take from this little tiny book that's 2,500 years old. Here it is, that Jeremiah is not just reflecting in his heart, he is pushing his heart toward what is true despite what he sees with his eyes. He's pushing his heart in a direction. He's doing what Tim Keller did long before there was a Tim Keller. He's literally pushing his soul toward God. Listen, friends. He is rehearsing what he knows to be true so that hope will rise again inside of him. That's what he's doing. He is purposely reminding himself of what he believes. And I want you to see this. There are 5 chapters in this little book. The first 2 really begin to point where they just dump and they just are like, it is as bad gets. It cannot get any worse. And then chapter 3 is sort of like the summit of this entire little book. And then it kind of goes back to, oh my goodness, this is really, really bad. But chapter 3 is different. And in particular, there is really 3 different sections in chapter 3. And the middle section of chapter 3 is a turning point. It is a shift. Everything becomes different with this little middle section. All of the pain, all of the struggle, all of the hardness of life, something shifts in Jeremiah in the dead middle of this little chapter. And so we're going to do, if it's okay with you, we're going to do an old-fashioned, old-school Bible study. We're going to walk through this together. Y'all with me? Can y'all hang here? And Taylor, y'all, Riverview, can you guys hang with me? Because this is so important. This is old school. There's nothing fun about this. We're going to learn together. We're going to grow our faith together. And here's what we need to know about this little book of Lamentations in the 3rd chapter. Structurally, now this is really interesting. Structurally, chapter 3 is written totally different than the rest of the book. See, the first 2 chapters of this book each have 22 verses in them. Each have 22 verses in them. They're actually sonnets in Hebrew, 22 little sections. And they're written along with the Hebrew alphabet. You wouldn't be able to pick this up in English at all. You have to actually know Hebrew to do this. I don't know Hebrew, but I studied it, okay? Now listen. This is really interesting. Every verse, starting with the first verse, is like moving through the English alphabet. Like the first verse starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second verse starts with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it just goes all the way through. All the way through. Now, chapter 3 is different. It's not written like A, B, C, D. It's actually 3 times longer than the other chapters, and there's a reason it's 3 times longer. It's written differently. It's like a song. It's like a poem, and it's written differently. Instead of going A, B, C, D, it goes A, B, 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 C, 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 D, 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 all the way through. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And so he's tripling up his thoughts. And so not only is there one little sonnet, starting with the first letter, there's actually 3 sonnets, 3 little motions, if you will, 3 thoughts dealing with the same letter. Y'all with me so far? This is really cool, isn't it? I mean, there's something to this. But there's a reason I think that this is happening. I think it's because Jeremiah is letting us know, like when he goes through A all the way to Z, if you will, he's letting us know in the first 2 chapters that the destruction of Israel, this is why I think he was writing it like this in Hebrew, that the destruction of Israel was so thorough. It was A to Z. It covered everything. It could not get any worse than it is, right? But he wants us to learn something different in this chapter. By tripling up on every single letter, he's saying, we're going to elevate the thought a little bit. This is even more important than the destruction. You ready for this? This is cool, right? It's bigger, it's more important. And what's interesting about this little chapter is that there's 3 sections of it. You can think of it like a poem or maybe a song, right? And so it's pretty cool if you think of it like, songs have like verses and choruses, right? And pre-choruses and all that kind of stuff. But basically a verse and a chorus. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Y'all into music at all? Okay, because if you're not into music, I really don't even care about you. Okay, it's fine. You don't need to get this. But for the rest of us, right, music is a big deal, right? And you're used to hearing verses and choruses. But what's interesting is that there's like 2 verses and a chorus in the middle in this chapter. The first 20 verses kind of make up the first verse, and then the last 20 or so make up the second verse, and there's like a chorus. The big part is in the dead middle. And what's funny is they couldn't be more the opposite. Verse 1 and verse 2, looking at the exact same perspective, are completely different. They could not be any more different. It's like when a guy is writing a song about a girl and he's looking at a girl, he knows a girl, and he writes in verse 1 how amazing she is and she's incredible in every way, and she walks on water and all that kind of stuff. And then verse 2, she's a total loser, I can't stand her, she's horrible, she's the worst human being that's ever walked the planet. You go, what? Same girl. But that's what this is. It's Jeremiah looking at the exact same situation, but writing from 2 totally different perspectives. And so I want to give you just a little bit of a taste of this because I think it's important. I just want to illustrate this, and then we're going to even go deeper. But just to kind of get a big perspective, in the front end, in verse 18, first 20 verses in the front end, I just want to read verse 18 to you. It says, my endurance has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. He's like, I've given up on God. I've given up on everything. You see that, right? He's like, I am done. I've told you how bad it is, and all of this has led me to this. My endurance is gone. I have nothing left. I don't even love God anymore. My hope is gone, okay? Now, same chapter, same story, same everything. He, at the end, in verse 58, near the end of the second verse, if you will, he says it like this. He says, you have taken up my cause, O Lord, and you have redeemed my life. Do you see it? It's like you go, what is it, Jeremiah? Which side of the coin are we on here? Is it all bad or is it all good? Because I don't get it. You are totally losing your mind, right? Now, friends, listen. Pause for a moment. You've been there, right? Pain is coming. Life is spinning. And it's going down. And it is darkness. And you are like, God, I am mad at you. God, I am ticked off at you. And God, there is no hope. And I don't even know if I love you anymore. I don't even know if I want to know you anymore. I don't even know if I believe in you anymore. Anybody ever been there? Come on, be honest. A whole bunch of us have. But it's amazing. The next morning, the light comes on, right? The sun comes in. Something is different in the morning. Maybe it's 5 mornings later. Maybe it's 5 months later. But there's been a shift inside of you, right? Same situation, but you're looking at a different perspective now. And now you're going, maybe God is going to get me through this. Maybe there is hope. Anybody with me? You've been on both sides of that, right? That's Jeremiah. That's who he is. He's struggling with what you and I struggle with. This is no different for him than it is for us. This is real life. Now let me read how deep this goes in the first part of this. This will be like the first verse, and I want us to get how deep this goes because I think this will utterly lift your faith if we get it, because there is a defining moment in the middle that we're going to get to. But I want to show you the first part and then the second part. Then we're going to talk about this defining moment. I'm just going to read a couple verses. There's 20 verses in the first section, if you will, and it's misery all the way through. And I'm just going to read a couple of the verses for you. Starting in verse 1, it says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against who? Me, again and again and again. All day long, he has made my skin and my flesh grow old and broken my bones. Listen, you can't get any worse than this, right? He's like, God, you have ruined my life. You have ruined everything in me. You can see it, right? He says, he has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. And by the time he gets to verse 20, it's amazing. God has become personally overwhelming to him in a bad way. In verse 17, for example, he says, I'm miserable and I have no peace. Verse 18, he says, my grief and my pain does not cease. He says it's relentless. Pause for a second. Ever been there? Where you're just waiting for daylight to come. And you're going, it's got to get better. It's got to change. There has to be something different. And Jeremiah, at this point in his life, he's like, I am stuck here. I don't think I'm ever going to get out of this. I'm stuck. Now listen. And then but by verse 20, he goes, my soul is utterly downcast within me. He's just like, I'm done. There is nothing left, right? But the back half, it's so strikingly different. I want you to catch the depth of this. Okay, now in the back half of this, we're just picking up in verse 38. Same scenario, same everything, same man, but something's shifted. I just want you to see the back half shift, okay? He says this, is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both calamities and good things come? You see already, for one line, there's a difference, right? There's like, you know what? I can't take good and bad. I got to take bad and good. I got to take it all from God, right? And then he says this, why should the living complain when punished for their own sins? Let us examine our ways and test them, and let us, what is this? This is interesting. He says, let us return to the Lord. I thought he'd just given up on God. I thought he said, I'm done with you. I'm through with you. I'm over it. But now he's saying what? Let us return to the Lord, right? Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to the God of heaven. This couldn't get any crazier, right? In the same song, he goes from one end to the other. As a matter of fact, if you skip down to verse 55, it says this, I called on your name, Lord, from the depths of my pit. You heard my plea. He just spent like the last 2.5 chapters saying, you haven't heard me, God. You have not been listening to me. But now all of a sudden he's going, wait a second. You have heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. You came where? Near. God met him in this. When I called out to you and you said, do not what? Fear. Whew. Do not fear. You, Lord, took up my case and you, what does he say? You redeemed my life. So you see the difference, right? It's obvious. Are we all there together? Both of our campuses, we all together? This is so important. Now we're going to talk about the hinge. We're going to talk about the shift. What happened? What became different in this man? Here it is, verse 21. I think this is where it starts. Verse 21. It says, remember, this is a biblical lament. This is more than just sitting around pouting. This is searching for hope. It's a searching for answers. And a lament, I think we're learning this. A lament, it doesn't just express your heart. You hear me? It doesn't just reveal what you're going through. It shapes your heart. A real biblical lament that seeks God informs your life on the direction it should go. And that is what Jeremiah is doing here. It shapes your heart. It shapes your reaction. It shapes what you're going to do with the pain of life. And this is what he says in verse 21. Yet, you got to love that little word, yet. Anybody love that word? I love that word. Yet. He goes, yet this I call to my mind, and therefore I have hope. What is this word yet? It's like but. It's like, yeah, but listen. You got it? He's saying, but something's going to happen. Something different is coming your way. This word yet, or but as some translate it, it literally is like a marker in his life. The whole part of this book, every word up to that word was despair. Every single word. That one word changes everything. Yet. I do something. And he picks up on this idea of what he says, I recall to mind. You and I use, in English, we use a different phrase. I remember. He's remembering. He's purposing in his heart to remember, right? He says, I know everything that has happened to me. I know everything that has gone bad. He goes, but yet, I know something else. I know that there is a bad story, but that's not the only story. I know that there's pain, but that's not the whole story. I know that there is hurt, but that is not the whole story. I know that there is disappointment, but that is not the whole story. Somebody in the house needs to say something about that. Because he's saying, when I remember who God is, it reminds me that this is not my end story. That there's something bigger than that. There's something better than that. That there's something more than that out there. He is saying that there is more to this story. And so he uses this little phrase, I call to mind, or I remember, right? And it's like returning to something. He's remembering something. He's saying, listen, if you and I, in the middle of the hard parts, if we think of God, if we remember who God is, if we focus our life on who he is, things will be different. It's not your story. Jeremiah is not just reflecting about what's in his heart, he is pushing his heart in a different direction despite what he sees with his eyes. He's reminding himself of what he really believes. And in this world, when pain comes, it is easy to forget what you believe. It's hard. Verse 21. It is a game changer. The destruction of Jerusalem sends a message, right? But it's not the only message it sends. It sends a message, repent. It sends a message, you better knock it off. It sends a message that if you keep going the way you're going, it will not end well. But that is not the only message. It's not the only story. It's not all that there is. And he introduces this concept of hope. He introduces this concept that hope comes via remembering. And somebody in the room maybe needs to hear this today because Jeremiah is teaching us that hope does not come from when our circumstances change. Listen, hope does not come when our circumstances change. Hope comes when we remember who it is who is in charge of the circumstances. And that is utterly different. That is utterly different. In other words, you live through suffering by believing what you actually believe. You make it through pain by holding on to what is actually true and what is center in your life and what is most important in your soul. That's how we make it through pain. And so this is why a lament is uniquely Christian. And again, if you're not a Christian here today, we are so glad that you're here. And you're being exposed to what Christians really do believe about the suffering of our world. That this is a uniquely Christian thing. When we learn to lament, it mourns more than just what happens. It faces our heart. It moves our heart in a different direction. Lamenting is remembering what we really believe about God. This is learning to trust, listen friends, this is learning to trust the who behind the what. Woo! Oh, that's so good, Pastor Jay. Would you say that again? I will say that again. Lamenting, it carries this idea that you learn to trust the who is behind all of the what of your life. And friends, it doesn't get any better than that. And it doesn't get any more important than that or deeper than that. Now hear how this verse is anchored in the middle of this whole shift, okay? So this verse, I'm going to read it again, but I'm going to tack on two more verses. I want you to hear it as a whole package. This is what Jeremiah writes, okay, about remembering. That's what he says. He says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have what? Hope. Because of the Lord's, what is it? Great love. Remember that word. Great love. He says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. He's remembering. He's remembering. Jeremiah is forcing himself to move in a different direction. He's forcing himself to not get completely lost in his current circumstances. Have you ever been lost completely in your current circumstances? Don't lie to me. I'm the preacher. Shouldn't lie to me. Have you ever been completely lost in your current circumstances? Yeah. And Jeremiah says, don't do that. Terrible mistake. Don't do that. He's forcing himself to believe the right things. There is a shift in the middle of this lament, and it begins in verse 21. And it kind of travels forward from there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some observations, okay? Just about some stuff that I'm learning. This might be for you, I don't know, but I can tell you for me, this is life-shifting. The Hebrew word, the words in Hebrew that we get the words, great is thy loving kindness, the faithfulness. It's this word, hesed. And it's repeated over and over in this entire section, this little next section. Hesed is, it literally means, anytime you hear this in Hebrew, it would conjure up different ideas. The great love of God, the great faithfulness of God, the faithful love of God. Hesed is God's covenant love for his people, his promised love for his people. It's rooted in the very character and nature of God. And so when you read, great is your love, great is your mercy, it's the same word, various forms of it, reminding the people that God is merciful. God keeps coming at them over and over and over, even when you think God has forgotten you. He doesn't forget. You may forget. I may forget, but he does not forget. Amen? Anybody hearing me? And so he's saying that great is thy faithfulness morning after morning. It's like that song, great is thy faithfulness. It's got kind of a march to it. Great is thy faithfulness. Remember that? Morning by. Anybody? And he is saying that God's faithfulness doesn't stop reaching toward us. Suffering and hardship show us that there is something deeper still. It is showing us that the mercy of God, the grace of God is not is at the bottom. Listen, that sin is not the bottom. Woo! The brokenness of this world is not the bottom. Listen, the devil himself is not the bottom. The bottom, the top, the sides is all the grace of God. All of it. It's whatever sin you've struggled with, there is something deeper still, the faithfulness of God, the love of God that keeps coming at you. It's amazing. And so the first learning is that God is faithful. God is faithful. You ever been there where you just feel so lost that you're just not going to get out of it? He says, don't stop there. There is something deeper still. Hesed, the grace of God, the goodness of God, the love of God, the faithfulness of God. Your story, your current circumstance, it's not the end of the story. There's something deeper still. And that leads me to a second learning. That waiting is not a waste. Woo! Anybody? Waiting is not a waste. I think this is so hard to see. Maybe you can't even see it until you mature a little bit in life. I don't know. I just know that when you're young, you want everything now. And the human story, the human heart is a heart that says, fix it and fix it right now. I don't want this pain. But waiting is not a waste. Look at what Jeremiah says. This is such a great truth, you guys. Listen. He says, Jeremiah says in verse 24, it says middle section, it's this whole shift section. He says, I say to myself, Jeremiah says, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will what? I'll wait for him. It doesn't look good now. I'm not sure it's ever going to look good again. What is he going to do? He's going to what? He's going to wait, because waiting is not a waste. And he says this, the Lord is good to those who hope is in him. To the one who seeks him, it is good to what? Wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. You know, this is such a hard truth. It is good to go through hard times. What? No, it is. Because that's when we see God do his best work inside our soul. I'm an older parent now. I got a couple of older young adults, 18 and 20 years old. And I'm telling you something, it's hard to parent, right? Because you want to step in and you want to say, no, don't do that. If you do that, that's really going to be costly. You want to say, no, I'm telling you not to do this. But they have to learn through their own mistakes, right? And you hate to see your kids suffer. And you hate to discipline your kid. You hate it because you feel like you're making them suffer. But waiting is not a waste. Sometimes you can only know it if you have the yoke, that burden, that heaviness on you for a season of your life. Anybody ever been humbled? Anybody? Come on. Yeah. It changes you. To wait on the Lord, I'm learning, it means to place your hope in him. It literally means I can't fix it, but I'm going to trust you through it. Waiting is good. Waiting is not a waste. It means that you're trusting that God is the one who can deliver you from the situation that you're in, that he is the hope. Waiting is not a waste because it teaches you to trust that God has something more, that God has something better, that God has something deeper still for you. And if you have ever been in darkness, and that mercy comes in the morning, and that light comes back on, I am telling you, it didn't seem like it when the shades were down, but when the light finally came back on, there is a new love for God. There is a new deepness with God. There is a new walk with God. There is a new hope in God. There is a new trust in God. Anybody ever been there? Yeah. Waiting is not a waste. And this leads me to the next, big learning for my life is, and you may want to pay attention to this if you're particularly not a Christian. If you're like kind of going, I'm not even sure what I believe, and you don't even know what I've done, and I'm not even sure if you would even allow me in your stupid church if you knew what I did. If you are like here going, no, I've done things that I didn't even think I would do. There's a message that Jeremiah has for you. And that is that God is not done with you. That God is not done with you. Everyone in the house at both of our campuses, listen to me. Listen to me. I want you to hear this, that oftentimes we limit God's grace by saying, no, I don't deserve it. We limit God's goodness by saying, you don't even know. You don't know how far my heart has gone. Don't do that, because God is not done with you. Listen to what Jeremiah says. He says, for this, you cannot get any clearer. Verse 31. Now he is looking at a people who have been utterly destroyed because of their own sin. Utterly lost because of their own blackness of soul. And this is what he says. He says, for no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Woo! No one is put off by the Lord forever. So in other words, when he is disciplining you, you might feel the hand of God against you right now. You might feel like the weight of life is against you. You may feel like God has forgotten you for now, but he says it ain't gonna last forever. Sometimes God will teach you when you're down, amen? But he's only wanting to bring you back up. He has no plans of leaving you down there. This is what he says. He says, for no one is cast off by the Lord God forever, though he brings grief, though God brings discipline, though God brings hard times, though God brings pain. He says, he will show you, what is this word? Compassion. So great is his unfailing hesed, his unfailing love. Great is thy faithfulness. He says, don't you forget it. God is not done. You may be done. Your friends might be done with you. Your friends might go, I'm not showing you any grace. I had enough of your buddies at work might be, I'm done with you. I'm through with you. I've given you 15 chances. Your neighbor might look at you and think you're the biggest jerk on earth. Your mama may not even like you. She said, I'm not giving this kid any more grace. I've given him 100 chances. But thank God that your God is not your mama. Thank God that your God is not your buddy at work or your neighbor down the road. Because God looks at my junk and he says, get up. Get up. Get up and do something. Get up and move the right direction. Because I'm not done with you. And the reason that God is not done, and this is the last learning that I got, is because God is always good. Always good. Some people think that God has afflicted them on purpose to somehow bring them down. You have missed the whole point of pain then. Some people think that things have happened, disappointments happen, and God has somehow turned his hand against you because he hates you. He doesn't hate you. He uses pain in a unique way to what? To grow your soul, to make you become something different, to make you realize your need for a Savior. Pain is a great gift. It is, listen, suffering is hard, but it is not bad. It is not bad. It is a gift from God to remind you that you need Jesus. And here's how Jeremiah says it. Listen to this. He says it at the end of this middle section, this great turning point. He says, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. It's not like God is going, man, I cannot wait to kick Jeremy down. Can't wait to just stomp all over him. If you think that about God, then you have no idea who God is. That is not his hope for me. It is not his hope for you. God is always good. Good. He's good. So in order to remind us of who God is, we're going to sing this old hymn. Okay? We're going old school. Both of our campuses, we're going old school. This song, Great Is Thy Faith, it's almost 100 years old, and we're still rocking it out. 100 years old. Written in 1923. And it reminds us of the faithfulness of God, of the goodness of God, that he's not done with us. So maybe you'll just sit there at both of our campuses. Maybe you'll stand. I don't know. Maybe you'll sing. Maybe you'll just read along. But I want this song to speak to your soul. Great is thy faithfulness.